In this lesson, we're going to talk about formatting on the pivot table. We're going to go over some basic color and row shading formats, and we're going to see how some of the behaviors can be applied to a pivot table. So what you're looking at now on the Pivot Formatting tab is the pivot table we made in a previous lesson, but it's got a green header, some green colors, different headings for the columns and the rows, and it's got some behaviors that we'll see. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and just rebuild that pivot table because it's always good to practice building pivot tables in the beginning. That's how you'll get better. So let's go over and click on the Bakery Shop tab and then click somewhere in our table and go to Insert and Pivot Table. And now it did guess correctly. We want the entire table of the bakery shop, but we don't want it on a new worksheet. We want an existing worksheet. We'll click our reference arrow and go over to Pivot Formatting. We'll put that on row 24, expand that out again, click OK. And now we've got our pivot table construction area. We've got the area to build the pivot table fields, and we've got our fields list over on the right. So let's go ahead and put items on rows and location on columns. And again, Excel is building the pivot table structure for us. And now we'll do items sold under values. Now Excel correctly guessed we're going to do sum of items sold, so we'll leave that alone. Okay, so one thing I want to show you before we go any further, we have our pivot table. We use the PivotTable Fields box to build our pivot table. So if you click off of the pivot table into your worksheet, that goes away. To get it back, all you have to do is click in a pivot table. And this is a pivot table too, so it actually has a different pivot table fields box. So let's go down here and I'll just show you that you can actually make this pivot table fields window go away sometimes. So if I click close, now if I go click out of my worksheet and click back, it doesn't come back. So this is where you need to learn how to turn that back on if somehow it gets turned off. Once you're on your pivot table, if you go up to the pivot table analyze, the very last commands in the ribbon we're going to look at. And you see the first one here is field list. That looks disabled. So we'll click on that and it brought it back. So this is how to toggle that pivot table field list on and off. But again, it always turns off when you click off of the pivot table. So now we want to add another element. If you look at this pivot table, we have this area up above the pivot table. It says day, and we've got a drop down. Well, what this is a filter on the pivot table. And I can click this drop down, and it has all the days we collected our data from. So if I want to just see one day's data, I can click on that day. When I click OK, the pivot table will just reflect that table's data. I can go click on another day, click OK. If I want to, I can click multiple days. I can click this checkbox and maybe I can do this. And now we're only seeing weekdays. So the big difference between this and the label and column rows is that whatever's in your filter, you're only going to be filtering your pivot table on that. It's not going to do a group by point for each of these days because they're in the filter. It's just filtering out information. Okay, so I'm going to show everything else here. And that's different because if I take something off of my product, say I don't want to see whoopie pies, it still shows the rest of the products and a roll-up point for them. That's different than the filter. I'll also tell you that filters are rarely used now. We're going to learn slicers later. That's probably what you're going to use. But they are still a component of pivot tables, and you can use them. So let's go down to our pivot table below, and let's add in that day filter. So I'll just click day, drag it to filters, and that's all there is to it. Well, now that we have our pivot table in a basic color scheme, let's look at some of the others. So for that, we're going to go up to the design menu, go over to PivotTable Styles, and we're just going to click styles in here. The top third are kind of light styles. They don't have very interesting formatting going on. Then I can go down here to the middle styles, which have a little bit more color. And it looks like even on these, it looks like there's a subheading. I don't see it here, but on my pivot table styles, I see a little darkened row there. So let's see what that's all about. I'm going to go here, and so far we've got a pivot table that just has rows and columns. What if I want to see it more in an outline view? So I can go over here to location, and I can drag it on top of item, and now I have multiple dimensions in my rows. That means I can sum up by the product, but also by the store. And you see what happens now that I have more than one element? My locations get a subheading. So let's look at this for a second. Now that I have multiple dimensions in the rows, I can roll those up too. So beside each of those, we have a plus or minus button. I can click that and it'll collapse all the data underneath that so that just Brooklyn is showing. Same with Manhattan and same with Queens. If I want them back, I can click it again. The plus minus buttons are neat, but they're not the only way to expand and collapse. I can double click on a heading and it'll collapse it automatically. If it's collapsed, I can double click it again. And finally, I can right click on it and go to expand or collapse, and I can expand that group or collapse it, or the entire field. This is really useful if you have a large pivot table and you want to collapse the entire thing. All right, so let's look at this plus minus right here. Those are tools to help expand or collapse. Those can go away too. So let's go back to our pivot table, go back to Analyze, and all the way in the end on Show, we have plus or minus buttons. This is how you toggle those on or off. So now I don't have the buttons, now I do. If I don't have them, then I can still double click and I can expand that category. Another thing to show you about categories, if I'm on a product here and I click the drop down that's above it, that drop down gives me access to all of the products. You see that? Cakes, cookies, croissants. Let's go ahead and hide muffins and click OK. Well, what if I want to get rid of Manhattan? I don't want to see that. Let me expand Queens too. What if I don't want to see Manhattan? I can go up here and click the drop down, and now it's just the locations. Okay? Now that worked because this drop down on the row labels is responsive to what you're on in the pivot table. So if I'm on a location, that drop down arrow is going to give me locations. And if I'm on a product, that drop down is going to give me the products. And I'll put muffins back, and I'll go ahead and put Manhattan back. Now let's look at another format option we have. And from our design ribbon, let's click on banded rows. Okay, it gave a little line on each row. That's okay, but it's not great. But if you look in your PivotTable styles now, you have some more distinctive styles. Now that we've checked banded rows, look at these. All these styles here will make every other row a different color. And that's called banding. It makes it easier to read the numbers if you're going across a large table. So I'll click that one. And now look what happens if I hide a couple items. If I just hide one, it automatically bands the rows every other one, no matter if you insert or delete an item. The formatting is automatically done for you, and that's really nice. So I'll click that. Now I'm going to put my location back under columns. And now we can look at hiding and showing headers. So we'll go back up to our PivotTable Analyze ribbon. And at the very end, we have field headers. And look what it hides. So if I take field headers off, it hides the column labels, the row labels, and our drop-down boxes. So I can hide those or show them, either way. The other thing we might want to change is that we've got row labels and column labels, but they're not really that intuitive. They're not that helpful. So if I want to change that, I can just click on the column labels and type in whatever I want that to be. And then I can go over to the rows and type in products. And lastly, we have items sold as our data points, the sum of items sold. That's actually accurate up here in the left corner of the pivot table, sum of items sold, but it's not really how we might want to say it. So we can click in there and just type number of items sold and click enter. Okay, the last thing I want to show you guys is that sometimes when you're formatting your pivot table, you might make the columns a certain width and you want it to look a certain way. It might be part of a dashboard or a report you're giving out. Then when you go to change something in the pivot table, like take away whoopie pies, for example, click OK, it automatically resized your columns. That's not what we want. We want it to stay put. Unfortunately, Excel defaults to resizing the columns. And I think it's because the pivot table is supposed to be dynamic and it can grow and shrink with whatever you select. But we have formatted this in a way that we want it to be that size and shape. So let's go see how to fix that. On our Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, we'll go over to the Options, click that, and on the Layout and Format tab of Pivot Table Options, come all the way to the bottom, we've got two check boxes. Auto Fit Column Widths on Update, and that's checked. Well, we just need to take that check mark off and then click OK. And now, if I remove things, the pivot table doesn't resize my column headings. So I'll click there, put those all back, click OK, and they're all back and it's not moving. So just remember that option. You can turn that on and off to resize the columns whenever you make a change in the pivot table. So in this lesson, we looked at some formatting options of pivot tables, and there will be more ways to format your pivot table in upcoming lessons. But for now, that's about it for this one. So let's get ready for the next lesson.